Hello, everyone. Today for Comm Research Methods, we are going to discuss a few things that are definitional. So if you need to pause this a few times, maybe take some notes. These are just important, important little pieces of jargon that you should know with regard to research. When you're talking about research, people will use these phrases. So just make sure that you're aware of what they are. I'm going to do my best to get through this quickly and just kind of get into the meat of the matter. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. First thing that I like to do during this class period specifically that we're not going to be able to do because we are not in the classroom, but hopefully you can do from home, all right, is I ask students about, what is communication studies, what is comm arts and science. If you are in this class, you're either a communication major or a communication arts and science major. So my question to my students is, why? Like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you in this major? Um, So if you are in this major, you should be able to answer these basic questions with regard to why you're interested in it, what are you going to do with it, what do you want to get out of it. You are spending lots of money and lots of time during the prime of your life pursuing this specific major. There are other majors you could have pursued. There are also ways you could have spent your time if you didn't go to college. So if you're spending the time and money to be in this specific field, at this specific time in your life, you need to have very intentional answers with regard to how you're structuring your life. So go ahead and take some time to really think about these questions. Down in the link below, I'm gonna put a little talk that I did for some of my high school kids about 6 months ago during quarantine. I'll go ahead and post it. It's a 10-minute video on sort of like how to make sure that you have a successful life for yourself. If you're interested, go ahead and watch it. But I would recommend you watch it to just make sure that you're asking very intentional questions about how it is you're spending your time and why it is you're pursuing the majors that you are pursuing. As far as communication, information exchange perspective, so it's how tools and channels transfer information. So usually it's, for most of human history, it's been verbal face-to-face communication. We've gotten into, further away, telephone, for example. Now a lot of our communication with regard to most of the people to whom we communicate is through social media. So we want to think about things like, how has Facebook changed the way we communicated with regard to time and distance. So for instance, in between the last video I made and this video, I got several text messages from a friend of mine who lives in Colombia. Her and I can FaceTime immediately in real time, right? Even though she's thousands of miles away on a different continent. These are things that change the way in which we communicate, which is then going to change the nature of the closeness of a relationship that you can have with a person. Most of our relationships throughout human history have had to have been with people who are in close proximity with us, because you need time and constant communication in order to foster a relationship. And now there's, people who we consider, our best friends who live far away, and we can still sort of maintain those relationships, in meaningful ways because we can communicate with them a lot. All right. Meaning is based on perspective, so how our experiences of reality are a product of the communication activity. So the ways, what this means is like the stories we tell ourselves shape our reality. This goes back to lots of points I've made with regard to, we live in a country that is very politically divided, and part of the reason it's very politically divided is because people hear two different stories about what America is. So if you have half of the population who is more aware of the Fox News narrative, they are going to perceive the country one way, as opposed to the other half of the country that is more in tune with the MSNBC narrative. Now, it doesn't mean that half the country watches Fox, half the country watches MSNBC. A very small portion of anybody actually watches those two news channels. But those two news channels create, narratives that sort of are pervasive throughout many different media outlets, including like online news, Facebook, Twitter, social media, etc. So that's why I personally am interested in communication, because communication helps us to tell the narratives, and those narratives create our lives. So it's not just about having good information, but if we think about it, religious services on Sunday, if religion shapes your value and belief system, like religion is all based on narrative. It's telling a story about creation, about purpose, about salvation, about redemption, about forgiveness, right? These are stories that are deeply in tune to the human experience. When we talk about classic literature, why is it that classic literature is classic? Why is it that it stands the test of time? It's because that generation after generation reads these stories, and we can all find ourselves in these stories, even if these stories are, decades old, hundreds of years old, in some cases thousands of years old, right? We keep coming back to the same themes, the same narratives. We all want to be the hero that, um, that sort of has an adventure, right? That, goes through the fire and comes out the back end. We have these sort of like coming into adulthood stories, and these stories have been around for thousands of years. We have these romance stories, and they're the same sort of, they're very similar generation to generation, all right? So that's what communication is, all right? How do these narratives shape the reality in which we are in? And what stories do I tell myself that make me create a reality for myself, all right? Communication refers to the process by which verbal and nonverbal messages are used to create and share meaning. So within the field of communication, there are different ways in which you can become a specialist. So during your undergraduate career, you're going to kind of take a class in each one of these items, right? When you get into your master's degree and your PhD, you start to specialize in one thing or another. So I mostly am interested in rhetorical analysis. So, if you take my rhetorical theory class, for instance, most of my research is based on rhetorical methods, the rhetorical tradition, which the rhetorical tradition is the most long-standing sort of specialty within communication, right? Communication studies wasn't a thing until about 100 years ago. Before that, it was sort of studying rhetoric, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle and all this like Aristotelian methods, sort of analyzing speech and narratives and stories and everything else, right? So rhetoric has the longest history sort of within the field. That's what I'm, most interested in. But I've taken like at least one or two classes in all of these items, throughout all of my schooling. So if you're in interpersonal communication, you're going to most likely study things like romantic relationships, friendships, one-on-one communication. You could do like boss with employer, as far as like these like small power dynamics within face-to-face. Rhetorical tradition, all right, larger cultural narratives with how they sort of shape the world around us. Intercultural, how do two different cultures, when they come together, how do they interact with each other? Organizational, this is more of like the business folks. If you're interested in like looking at like sports organizations, right? How does an NFL team become a Super Bowl championship team? Small group also fit into things like family communication. Gender self-explanatory. Performance, you could get into some things like Bakhtin, which we'll talk about. Sort of, it's interested in this sort of like life as a stage. Like how do we sort of put on these different roles? How do like you start speaking metaphorically, like our clothes are a costume, and we want people to see us a certain way. So we kind of go out in the world and perform these roles with regard to who it is we're interacting with. And then get back to family, which could also fit in a small group. Heuristics. Okay, this is the big thing for today. Well, one of the two big things. The other things is learn about variables. You need to watch this YouTube clip. It just talks about what heuristics are. Right? Heuristics are a really good way to start asking research questions. So watch this YouTube clip on heuristics. What heuristics are is, it's just sort of like shorthand ways in which we make the best assumptions we can about the world given limited information, right? So our personal interest, our personal assumptions, we sort of walk through the world and we use heuristics, which means that we try to figure out the answer based on based on our personal experiences, based on the best information we have. It's a shorthand to kind of get through the world, because there's too many choices and there's too many things to learn about. So instead of like learning about all of them and making the best choice, we use heuristics, which says like, this is probably the best choice because I don't have time to learn about all the food available in the cafeteria, but I know I like pizza, so let's just go for pizza. All right. Watch this YouTube clip on heuristics, and it's a good shorthand to sort of figure out, how it is we develop various interests within our research. Now, here's the thing with heuristics, though, right? You don't want to get caught in the trap of just cherry picking data that fits your pre-assumed conclusions about the world. So you might have heuristics with regard to how the world works, but once you start asking those research questions, you have to make sure that you recognize that you are prejudiced and biased towards certain conclusions, right? Your heuristics might lead you to certain conclusions. So you want to be very careful not to just cherry pick data that already fits your predetermined conclusions, right? Through trial and error, you're going to move research forward. And then the big question is, if you're not actively trying to move research forward, then what's the point of your research? So you constantly need to be rationalizing, why is this research important right now? Like, what might it help us figure out? How can I move the ball forward? Keep asking questions. So at the end of every good research project, there are additional questions. We call this the limitation section. In your conclusion, you write up the limitations that say, here are the questions that I forgot to ask. Here are the variables I forgot to look at. Next time around, here's some new questions that have sort of popped up that I think I can continue pushing with regard to this topic. All right, watch this YouTube video on heuristics. You just kind of need to generally know what it is for this sort of intro class. Basic or applied research. Basic research helps to define what the field is. It sets the paradigmatic boundaries. So we've talked about paradigms before, sort of what are the general assumptions about the field. And it helps to define what theories and methods are useful in the field. Right? So it's setting the parameters of the field. Applied research then uses those theories and concepts to address certain issues and solve certain problems. So if you do have case studies, you're going to apply the theories of the field to certain, sort of moments in culture to try to better understand those things. Basic, you're defining what the field is. Applied is you're using those theories and methods that have been defined. You're using those to apply them to outside situations. Now, with regard to how research should move, you should start with a general topic. Allow the topic to tell you which theory is best for you to use. Allow that theory to tell you which method you should be using. Allow your method to tell you whether or not you're going to choose a research question or a hypothesis, and then you design the study. We'll get into this more when we're talking about your research projects, but the long and short of it is there are some people in academia who are so committed to a theory, let's say, and they get so committed to that theory that every time they look at a topic, they want that theory to address that topic. But as you see here, the topic comes before the theory. So what this is trying to tell us is look at the topic. Don't force a theory onto a topic if it's not there. So for instance, there are people who are really committed to issues of class. So Marxism. And they're like, I'm a Marxist. Everything I look at is through the lens of Marxism. Sometimes you're going to have topics that have nothing to do with Marxism or nothing to do with class status. But there are people who want to make everything about class status. And so they're trying to force their theory onto a topic when it's not really there. You can think the same thing with like gender dynamics, right? There are people who are very committed feminist theorists, right? But then everything they see, they're always looking at it through the lens of feminism. And some of their research looks very muddled because you look at it and you're like, I don't think gender dynamics are at play in this situation, but you have now forced your theory onto a topic when it's not relevant, right? So you always want to make sure you look at your topic first and allow your topic to tell you which theory is best with regard to analyzing that topic. A research question versus hypothesis. A research question is open, all right? It's open. It's asking a question. Hypothesis is a statement, so it ends in a period. All right, research question ends in a question mark. There's going to be a question on the test about this, so just know the difference, okay? So our research question is something along the lines of, look, I'm interested in learning about, a certain topic. What question should I ask about that topic? So these are two research questions. What type of organization communication strategies are used here? That's an open question. Why do more women work as nurses and more men work as doctors? That's an open question. All right. These research questions are most likely going to be solved with qualitative methods. So for this question, for instance, you might go around, you might interview a bunch of women who are nurses and a bunch of men who are doctors, all right, to figure out the answer to that question, right? Or you might just interview a bunch of doctors, period, men and women, a bunch of nurses, men and women, and then figure out if there's differences with regard to the answers from nurses of people who are men versus the answers of nurses of people who are women, right? So you're just going to go around here and interview people. but your questions, research questions, should end in a question mark. Hypothesis makes a prediction. These are those if-then statements that you learned about in like 10th grade science class, right? So if I do one thing, then this other thing will happen. So if more women become doctors, then the gender wage gap will close in the health industry, right? In the health field. That's a prediction, right? So now all of a sudden you figure out a way to test it with regard to, you know, encouraging more women to become doctors, right? This is more often used with quantitative methods, so you're actually measuring, right? Numbers are involved. All right, hypothesis makes a prediction, research question is an open question. Variables, okay? This is definitely on the exam. Variables are things that you can manipulate during a experiment in order to try to make changes, right? To see if different results happen. So you're playing around with variables to figure out, like, if I play around with this variable, can I get a different result? Because if I figure out if I can get a different result, then when it comes to sort of real world application, applied research, I know that if I play around with certain variables, I can get the results I want sort of out in the world, all right? So the concept in question that needs to be isolated and measured and studied. That's what a variable is. Got to try to isolate what is actually causing the situation to happen. Okay, what is the actual cause of, say, income inequality? Let's say racial disparities in educational attainment. Right? I want to isolate the variable. What is the actual variable causing this? Because if I can isolate the variable, when it comes to real world application, I can tweak that variable and I can actually create changes that are useful. When you don't isolate the variable, what ends up happening, let's say racial disparities in educational attainment. If I don't isolate the correct variable, I start playing around with this other variable, I'm going to tweak it as much as I can, and we're still going to have disparities in racial attainment with regard to or educational attainment amongst various members of different racial groups. All right, so that's why knowing what your variables are is so important, because people get really attached to certain variables and they start tweaking them. And then they're like, but we're not getting any results. And it's like, well, you're playing around with the wrong variable. All right. So make sure you list all of the possible variables that could be causing racial disparities in educational attainment. If you get connected to one variable too much, this happens with people. They're like, it is this reason. This is the reason it's happening. And we need to throw more money at this particular variable. And then 10 years later, like, nothing changed. It's like, throw more money at the variable. Nothing's still changing. It's because you didn't put more money at the variable. I look at it and I'm like, maybe you chose the wrong variable. Maybe you're throwing money at the wrong thing. All right. So you want to make sure you look at all the variables possible, try to isolate them, try to tweak them, and then you could actually throw money at the correct variable, right? Or maybe the solution doesn't require money at all, right? Maybe it's just a reorganizing of the system. We go back to studying organizational communication. Maybe the organization has plenty of money, but the organization is all screwy. You go and study the organization, you're like, okay, you need to restructure your organization and everything will be fine. All right. So here we go with variables. There are things known as independent variables. There are dependent variables. Independent variables cause the change. Dependent variables are the things that are changed. All right. So, for instance, if you say please, then people are more likely to help you. Saying please is the independent variable. People helping you is the dependent variable. So I said please, right? That caused the change, and the change was people were helping me. All right. So independent variable causes a change. The dependent variable is what changes. Some more things on variables. There are what's known as ordered variables and there are nominal variables. Ordered variables are assigned numerical value, right? So things like age, weight, height, time, distance, right? These are ordered, right? They have numbers. Nominal variables cannot be quantified. So there are ways in which you can attach meaning or numbers to things like race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, etc., right? But you can't quantify them. So if I do a study and I want to look at different racial groups, right? Disparities in educational attainment, right? I can look at racial groups, but I can't number them, right? I can't attach numbers to those items, right? So there's other ways I have to sort of play around with figuring out the disparity with regard to racial or educational attainment amongst racial groups. All right. Ordered variables have numerical value. Nominal variables are more abstract. They can't be quantified. All right, some more stuff on variables. All right, I told you there's going to be a lot. Positive relationship is that when two variables interact, they both move in the same direction. So there are causal, right? We'll talk about causation, correlation here in a second. Positive relationship means that two variables that are interacting with each other, they both go up or down at the same time. So they have a positive relationship. For example, the more time I study, the higher my grades. So my study time goes up, my grades go up. Positive relationship. Negative relationship is that when one variable goes up, the other goes down, or vice versa. So the more I party, the lower my grades. All right? There's a negative relationship there. All right? Or it could be vice versa. You could say the less I party, the higher my grades. All right? So these two, grades and partying, are related, but they have a negative relationship because when one goes up, the other one goes down. Finally, correlation versus causation. You've probably all heard this phrase before. Let's discuss what it is. Correlation means that variables move at the same time, but they cannot be shown to be related. So a lot of people get on the news sometime and say, like, look, these two things are happening at the same time. And the question becomes is, well, are they causal? Do they interact? Do they actually cause each other to, or are they just correlated? Is it just coincidental? All right. So let's look for example. This could be a correlated relationship. People who watch TV, it's one variable, have higher rates of cancer. It's another variable. The question becomes is, does TV cause cancer? The answer is probably no. Like watching TV probably doesn't, like, there's not like cancer waves coming at you from the television. All right. So those two things might be correlated, but it might be just coincidental, or there might be a third variable that is causing both of these things that is unrelated, right? So sedentary lifestyle, for instance, maybe people who watch more TV just eat, eat bad food, or more likely to eat bad food, or they are also more likely to smoke, right? TV doesn't cause these things, but there might be a lot of unhealthy habits that are also correlated with watching excessive amounts of television. All right. So just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean they cause each other. Causation means that the variables are related. All right. So, the more I study, the higher my grades. Okay. So do things cause each other, or do they just simply happen in the same direction? And we have to argue about whether or not things are correlated or things are causal. All right, recursive causal variables, they work in one direction. Non-recursive works in both directions. So, quick example. The older people get, age is going up, the more information they disclose. All right, disclosure is going up. So you could say, look, age influences people to reveal more about themselves, which seems to pan out pretty well, right? The older people get, the less, they're already sort of like, they already have a family, they're probably already married, or they have kids, right? People withhold information because they want to be liked, right? But once you have, like, a wife, a spouse, a husband, kids, right? It's like, I already have people who like me, and if I, like, tell you some stupid information about myself, I don't really care, right? People are less embarrassed about themselves as they get older, and they're more likely to reveal things about themselves, right? However, this is recursive because it only works in one direction, right? I cannot make myself age just because I self-disclose. So if I sit there and I'm like, I'm going to tell you all the information about myself because I want to get older, I can't get older by disclosing information. It only works in one direction. As I get older, then the disclosure happens afterwards, right? I can't disclose in the hopes of now getting older. Non-recursive works in both directions. So exercising and dieting, it doesn't really matter which one comes first, right? If people diet and they see results, they might be encouraged to exercise more. If people exercise and they start to see results, they might feel like eating better food, right? And there does seem to be some sort of causal relationship between these things. So, I mean, there's some really interesting research with regard to, like, when you work out, right? Or what your morning routine is, right? If you wake up and you exercise, or, you do a little sun salutation, a little yoga, right? You eat a healthy breakfast, you kind of set yourself up like, I ate some good things, and, like, now I want to have a good, healthy day. Or, excuse me, let's back up. If I exercise in the morning before I eat, it's like I exercise, and it's my breakfast, I'm like, well, I just did all that working out. I don't want to eat garbage for breakfast. I don't want to eat a donut. I feel like having, like, some nice, eggs and some whole wheat toast and, whatever. All right. So if you exercise, that's going to kind of get into your brain like, I don't want to waste this exercise by now eating a donut. I want to use this exercise to like eat healthy. All right. Same thing is true with like if I eat healthy, I might say, well, I just ate healthy. Like maybe I'll do a little, I'll do a little stretching, I'll do a little workout, I'll go for a nice little run. All right. So exercise and diet can go in either direction. Age can only go in one direction. All right. Those are some introduction to some variables. If you need to go back and study these are definitely going to be on the test, but just kind of know these variations of variables. I know that this early stuff in this research method class is a little bit boring because it's lecture, but this is just sort of like foundational terms. You need to know what these terms are. You need to know how variables interact with each other. So just kind of learn this stuff. You need to know what heuristics are, and we'll get into more application and some more fun stuff with regard to research in the upcoming weeks.